Hello, I'm Patricia McNeely. I'm from Chicago, Illinois, and today I want to wish everyone a happy Father's Day. And I want to take a moment here to honor some of the people who have been great dads. And I'm going to talk about some of the African American gentlemen that have touched my life, starting from a child. So, as a child, growing up in Chicago, it was the 1960s, and there later was some turmoil. So I lived in an area where there was sort of like one store where everyone would kind of go shop at. It was Sears. Sears is kind of gone, bankrupt now. But the store was very significant because it was where we got to see people. And as a child, I would always gravitate to, play with the other kids because to me, they were just kids. But the school I went to was a school where we were, starting to bring in people that were different from us, okay? Because it wasn't just African American kids, some were Hispanic. And sometimes all we were doing was kids playing, but we had some great teachers. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the people that have kind of been along my journey that touched my life, and to remember that everybody's life matters. But today it's about the dads, it's about the gentlemen, it's about people who are just, strong, lovely, loving people, despite some of the things that they have going on in their lives, because sometimes you just never know who's going to touch you. So I'm going to start with back in school. I wanted so badly to be a patrol boy, and I'm not a boy, and girls could not be patrol boys. But Mr. Harris, who was African American, he was our gym teacher. He was also in charge of the patrol kids, the patrol boys. And he took a chance on me, and he trained me, and he made me the first patrol girl in that school. So I was pretty honored, and I was pretty infused with the gravity and responsibility of it to look out for the little kids. And this is how he was. He just took time with you. He explained things. He broke it down so that you could understand it. And he was a very admirable man. So thank you, Mr. Harris, on top of being a great gym teacher who never made a distinction between the weak kids and the strong ones and the athletes and the nerds. Everybody was welcome. Thank you. Mr. Riley. Our school hired someone who was a dance instructor. Now, this was at the height of disco. So just imagine having someone who was going to teach you disco moves, which was so trendy at the time and cutting edge. And that was Mr. Riley. And Mr. Riley put up with a lot of the boys goofing off because I don't remember people being slurry. They were just being kids, not paying attention. And he had a lot of tolerance and patience for us learning. And again, everyone was learning. We had kids we played with. We had kids at recess we played with. As a child, I didn't really understand some of the divides that were happening because my parents didn't raise me that way. In fact, my parents had a graphic arts studio, and they had a good friend who they collaborated with. Now, this woman, her name was Linda Sparks Jones. She knew John Johnson from Johnson Publishing. And between the two of them, they did a photo shoot for some of his products that it still stands out for us. It was a big step for my parents, and he took a chance on everyone. He took a chance on her. He took a chance on my parents. And as a result, we got some of the products that they shot. We still to this day, I brought it up to my mother, and she said, if you ever find some Ultra Sheen, let me know, because I love that stuff. That stuff works wonders on my hair. The products were excellent. They weren't interested in getting the products back, so my parents kept them, and we used them. And my mother would go on the hunt for them, which shocked a lot of people, but it was good. It was good quality. So thank you, Mr. John Johnson, for being expansive and being tolerant and giving chances. Thank you, Mr. Harris, for giving chances. Thank you, Mr. Riley, for helping us launch. That brings me to one of my first significant jobs I had. Mr. James Oliver Bibbs III, he was our boss. He was in charge of an entire floor and department, and he was in charge of a lot. And he was also a former Chicago police officer, so he knew the streets. In fact, I strongly suspect, although I can't confirm this, that having that as some of his experience gave him a wide range and ability to understand, how he would, let's say, enforce the things that needed to be enforced, because we were a neighborhood bank. They lent to people in the neighborhood. You knew your neighbors. You had to go ask them. And remember, this is back in the day before the internet. And he would literally go out and see people. There were many people that he took under his wing and helped them get on track, helped them get help to somehow restructure their house note, help them to really, just have a helping hand. Now, he also helped me personally, because one day there was a customer that called, and he got one of my coworkers after me. So his wife had called, I talked to the wife, then later the wife called, got one of my coworkers who was a bit nasty. So when this customer got home from work, his wife was in tears, and he came in, and the only name he had was mine. So I came back from my dinner break, and Mr. Bibbs calls me in and says, please come in here. There's a gentleman here. Do you know Mr. So-and-so? And I said, it's familiar. I may have spoken to him on the phone. And the man goes, if you were a man, I'd punch you in the face. And Mr. Bibbs says, now calm down. We're going to get this resolved. That's not how she is. And we're going to resolve this. There's no need for violence. We're going to resolve it. Turns out it wasn't me, but I was very apologetic to the man because I couldn't imagine what I had done. Turns out it was someone else, because later I got an apology phone call. But Mr. Bibbs stood up for me. Mr. Bibbs got us training. He got us training with consultants to tell us how to talk to people over the phone. And the consultants were also an African-American firm. So it was definitely a place that was progressive to work, which was very refreshing. We once had a family come in where the parents had brought in their two little boys. And the two little boys were just being boys. And the parents had to talk to Mr. Bibbs. And so what happens, just being kids, making a little bit of noise, the parent, the dad, goes over and slaps his son across the face so hard. And this did not go unnoticed by Mr. Bibbs. Mr. Bibbs asked the father to come into his office privately. Meanwhile, we attended to the child, who was crying profusely by now. And this apparently was going on in that household quite a bit. Mr. Bibbs was not having it in his office or anywhere, because that's the kind of man he was. No need for violence. You're going to settle things, you're going to man up, and you're going to do what's right in a good way. And so he talked to the man, and he did kind of have to put the boots to him and say, look, I know you're already under stress. We kind of got the short version. We couldn't hear everything, but this can't continue. This is part of the issue of why you're in here, why things are falling behind. I'm here to help you get on track. I want to hear this. You can't do this. Those kids are looking up to you. And that's the kind of man he was. He was a father figure to many people. There are still people to this day that will swear up and down that they have their house and they have their marriage together because of him. And, he touched a lot of people's lives. And he was in a position to do so because we had some tough jobs. We had people that would, sometimes they couldn't pay the house note and literally go out and knock on the house and see what's going on. He would round up help from local charities, some of the churches, and that's the kind of man he was. He was in touch with the people. He was in touch with people who needed that. And that's how he was. He encouraged education. He encouraged people to go back to school. He himself went to school while he was working as a full-time cop and put himself through school. And he encouraged his sons to do so also. So thank you, Mr. Bibbs. The next person, another person at another place I worked, Moses Jones. When I was so nervous, you put me at ease. You showed me how to operate cars because this was at an auto dealership. And Mo, as we affectionately called him, he was in the union. And so he was a union man, but he took time so that he could teach me. He actually taught me how to make coffee, which became part of my job. And he was a great guy. He was a little bit of a jack of all trades, which was great because he knew little tricks with cars that would get things humming right away. And he made sure to it that I felt comfortable because I was the only girl with all these men I was working with. And I think he understood that. I think he understood that maybe I was nervous. I was a little uncomfortable. He was sensitive. He was reasonable. And he was very funny. He had such a great sense of humor. So thank you, Mo. Mr. Curtis Stone. Yes, that is a common name, but you were a great example of how to, be a little bit tough and still listen to people and be able to understand that whatever people are going through, that you can help them to shift it. Okay, he had this great ability to help things get focused so that all of the drama, because he was in the collections department, they dealt with people with drama. They dealt with people who would pull out their gun and say, "Don't darken my door, get out of here." And he was a great go-to guy, but he was no pushover at all. He couldn't be. He couldn't afford to be. Not where he was, not, being in that position, heading things up in that regard. But he was very fair and he was very willing to work with people because you need to sometimes. And the next person I'm going to is Mr. Paris Lewis, who I dated for a while. And yes, you were a stand-up guy. You stepped forward when I was pregnant and when perhaps we thought that perhaps my son was your son. Thank you. Thank you for bringing me flowers to the ultrasound. And thank you for being willing to step up even when it turned out that you were not the father, that you still wanted to teach my son baseball, that you inquired. That was commendable. That was above and beyond. I couldn't, in all sincerity or honor, ask you to do that, but I do appreciate it. And in many ways, you two are a beautiful person that really deserves everything that you exemplify too. So thank you, Paris. And to anyone that's out there that sees images of Chicago and you see things about, the turmoil that's going on here. This happens in almost every big city, okay? Every big city has its trouble spots. Does not exemplify the people. It doesn't exemplify the great men that are here, the great dads, the guys that take time, the guys that spend time with their kids, with their families, that, feel it and really want to be just in love, loving their kids, their house, their communities. And that is how it is. This is not the 1960s. This is different. And there's rebuilding going on everywhere. There's building that's putting people to work. There's building that's helping people reinvest. And it is helping many of the men and the dads that we know to not feel disenfranchised, to feel a sense of belonging, to feel a sense of being able to put the past behind them. And that is what my hope is. And I hope that by sharing some of this, sharing some of my story, and just some of the people that have touched my lives, on top of some of the great food, the great jokes, the great music, good times that we've had, that it doesn't stop. I have this picture that I got, which I like to show people, about my city, Chicago. Okay? And it says here, Chicago sleeps only so that it may dream. And this is very true. It is an embracing and warming sight, contrast culture, working class citizens' inspiration. You'll find inspiration and artwork all over the city, created by wonderful people, wonderful craftsmen, great food. We're our hub for food. And you can't have that unless you have some great dads and great father figures starting to get things on track. I've also had the honor of meeting the great Harold Washington, and he was a great mayor. He impressed me because I met him personally by accident. It was actually at a Polish restaurant, believe it or not. My family on my mother's side is Polish. And there we were in this restaurant in this neighborhood, and in comes some people. In comes Harold Washington. He was being followed by some people, photographers, because at the time, this was so new. An African-American man was running as the mayor of Chicago. And this was huge. It was huge nationwide news. And there he was with his people who were his part of his political campaign team and some of his other support people. So they came into a place that to them must have seemed so foreign. They were hungry and they decided to stop at a restaurant. Well, wouldn't you know it, my uncle, who actually has, he was accustomed to working with the city. He stepped up and, they were looking at some of the Polish food. Now I'm 13 years old and I had just had, it was actually my confirmation day that day. So we were celebrating with a dinner, and they didn't know the Polish language and couldn't read the menu because it was in Polish. I couldn't read the menu. It was in Polish, not English. But they looked, and it was that day that I found that some people who have had very little to eat or work with have elevated foods to an art form. They looked at the shanks, the cabbage, some of the foods, and they were like, oh, that looks familiar. Because I found out later, years later, that Slavic food is essentially slave food and that there's many commonalities. But here's the thing. It made them feel comfortable. We wanted them to feel comfortable. And I have a photo with me with Harold Washington with his arm around me. And the force of the man, just like he was like a force of nature. So good-hearted. Even at the age of 13, I could sense this about him. And we took a picture, and we still have that. I don't think it was used in the magazine, but we have that picture. These were exciting things for us. I know that sometimes people think other people don't care, but we do. Anyways, I just wanted to take a minute today to say thank you for being the lives that mattered to me. Thank you to all the fathers. I miss my own dad. I can't pick up the phone and call any of these people, but I do want to say you're not forgotten. So for all of us, to absent friends, may we see you again. Thank you.